going to get started. Hello and welcome to our educational forum tonight called Advancing Inclusive Economic Growth. This is being hosted by the League of Women Voters of the White Bear Lake area. My name is Liz Lauder and I am the president of the League of Women Voters of the White Bear Lake area. The League of Women Voters has spent the last 100 years educating the people in our communities about the important public policy issues of the day. And we provide information about candidates for public office in a nonpartisan way. The League studies and takes position on issues. However, we do not support or oppose any political candidate or political party. The League for the White Bear Lake area covers 30 communities in the Northeast Twin Cities metro area. The membership is open to women and men 16 years of age or older, and you don't have to be a US citizen to be a member. One of our co-sponsors tonight is the Shoreview Human Rights Commission. This discussion is being featured as part of their ongoing series, It's Time to Talk About Race. The Shoreview Human Rights Commission meets on the fourth Wednesday of the month at 7 p.m. Our other co-sponsor tonight is Do Good Roseville. They hold monthly community conversations about race. Their next conversation will take place on March 11th at 7 p.m. The topic is How Race is Lived in America. I'd like to thank both organizations for their help in publicizing this event tonight, and we appreciate the work that they're doing in our communities. I'll be providing links to both organizations in the chat a little bit later on. This forum is being recorded and will be available later on our YouTube channel. A link will be provided on our website, which is www.lwv-wbla.org. The forum is also being broadcast on the Suburban Community channels. You can go to their Facebook page to see the broadcast dates and times. We expect the program to last approximately 1 hour. Audience members' microphones are muted to avoid background noise disruption and to keep the conversation moving without interruption. So we invite you to put any questions that you want to ask our guest tonight in the chat area on the screen. Now that I've got all those housekeeping pieces out of the way, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our participants tonight. So Tawana Black is the founder and chief executive officer of the Center for Economic Inclusion. This is the first of its kind organization in the country, and it's dedicated exclusively to creating inclusive regional economies by equipping public and private sector employers to dismantle institutional racism and build a shared accountability for inclusive economic growth. Ms. Black has successfully pioneered or advanced community economic development projects in Minneapolis and Omaha, Nebraska. She serves on several nonprofit and philanthropic boards of directors and is a non-resident senior fellow of the Brookings Institution. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Public Administration from Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas. And our facilitator tonight is Lisa Larson. Lisa is a League member and she serves on our board of directors as the director of program. She is an attorney and a former educator and a former Minnesota House research analyst. And so now I'll turn it over to Lisa and she will explain the structure of the meeting tonight and welcome our guest speaker. Go ahead, Lisa.
Good evening, Tawana. We are so thrilled to have you as our program speaker tonight. The number of people who have signed up to attend this meeting is quite large, certainly by our standards. And the presence of all these people testifies to the importance of the program, its timeliness, and the profound interest in issues that surround economic inclusion. As we discussed earlier, we propose to divide this program into 3 parts with time for questions after each part. In part 1, we hope you'll talk about the Center for Economic Inclusion, its work and its accomplishments, and also your professional work as the center's founder and CEO. In the second part, we hope you'll talk about the center's goals and next steps. For example, I've been attending your noon hour programs this month where panelists have discussed issues including transit equity, wealth equity, economics of place, and I believe the next program is about philanthropy of place. Hopefully, in talking about the center's goals and works, you'll tell us, among other things, about yourself, the current public policies and policymaking processes that you find most helpful, other policies and processes that you would find helpful, some of the obstacles that might hinder your work, and near-term and longer-term outcomes the center would like to achieve. So now, if I may, here's Tawana and part one having to do with an overview of the center and Tawana's work.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that welcome. And thank you, Liz, also for welcoming me this afternoon or evening now. It's great to be here with each one of you. I'm really excited for the opportunity to share the work of the Center for Economic Inclusion with all of you and to get to know the work that you all are doing in your own organization and in your communities. This evening, I'm going to share my screen with you to give you an opportunity to see some of what I'll share this evening through each one.
I think I just muted Tawana. Hold on just a minute. Sorry about that. Where?
I don't see her anymore.
Did I just delete her? Oh my goodness. Oh, she's coming in again. I'm so sorry.
Okay, she's back.
I need to make her a co-host. So. Okay. There she is. Okay. Is she able to?
Well, there's her.
Right. How do I see? Oh, need the participants. Apologies, everyone. This is one of those things that happens on Zoom calls. Let's see. There.
Well, there we go, folks.
Okay,
Thank
so
you
sorry
all
about
so
that.
much for grace. It would not be a Thursday night if we did not have a little bit of conflict and comedy, but I promise you we'll make up for it. Thank you all for grace there. It's wonderful to be back with you now. And now I'll jump into the presentation to share a bit about how we've gotten started in this work at the Center for Economic Inclusion of working to build an economy that works for everyone. I hope that you can see the screen right now. Give somebody to give me a head nod. Perfect.
Yes.
So our mission at the center is the work of supporting both public and private sector employers and leaders throughout our communities and economies in disrupting the way that each one of us work every day, particularly inside businesses and government agencies, in order to catalyze an economy that truly works for everyone. And as been shared, I'll go about the work of sharing how we do that work and why we got about that work as I founded the center just a few years ago. In our economy in Minneapolis and St. Paul and the surrounding communities, for some time, we've been able to compete as one of the best economies and communities and regions across the country. We're known for having some of the best parks, some of the best housing and schools of any metro area in the country. And yet, when it comes to race and racism specifically, how our Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian communities fare, we have been challenged. More than that, we have been failing for many years. And yet we've often gone about solving for those failures as a microcosm, solving for them through what we describe at my organization often as through the lens of charity. But when we study the data that we started looking at in my organization several years ago, we find that no longer can we afford as a region to examine it simply through the lens of how those disparities in education or health outcomes, economics, jobs, employment are impacting just those communities, but we see that those outcomes are now impacting our entire economy. They're impacting our ability to compete with other regions and cities across the country. And those cities, those that you see listed here on the screen, are those regions that our business leaders have determined are those we need to compete with for the best talent, for the best businesses who are going to grow our economy. And we find that many of them are starting to solve for this in ways that were better than Minneapolis, St. Paul. And we needed to do something different. What different though? When we looked at this, we found that in Minnesota, we were making some progress year over year at addressing employment gaps, where a lot of the focus tends to be zeroed in on, at getting more people to work. And all of this data predates COVID. We'll actually have new data coming out just next week from the Brookings Institution that gives us some refresh on this. But we haven't made any data as it relates to addressing a very key important factor, which is the earnings gap and the median gaps as it relates to wage equity. Wage equity speaks to whether or not when people are hired into the same job, they're paid the same. As a group of women voters, you're no doubt familiar with wage equity as it relates to gender. We find that those same types of gaps are very stagnant when it comes to race in Minnesota. That for a long time, more than 15 years in fact, Minnesotans have failed to pay Black and white workers the same amount of money for the same job, whether we're talking about people at the lowest rungs of the economic ladder or at the highest rungs, even up to those who are credentialed with a doctorate degree. We see serious gaps in pay equity that are contributing to our relative poverty rate and our gaps in median earnings. So our organization has begun taking this on to help decision makers understand what we must do in order to see our economy grow. This data on this slide helps us understand that even as we look at this data compared Minnesota to a national perspective, while there are still gaps there, those gaps are not nearly as gross or as stagnant at a national level as we see in Minnesota, requiring us to examine what role we can play in this and where we put our emphasis. In our case, focusing that emphasis on uprooting racism. The opportunity that we have also zeroes in on the solution that we found here, which is on taking a focus on employer actions. This study done by Accenture and released just last year in coordination with Women's History Month found that while employers were focusing more and more on inclusion and equity, trying to create an environment that works for everyone, those actions, those efforts and initiatives are not actually working. While many employers would describe themselves as creating an environment that works for everyone, employees were actually not buying it, not feeling like they could truly be themselves and bring their full selves to work and still be rewarded and move up the ladder at the same pace as their peers. And yet Accenture found after doing a 3-year study that if corporations were to close that gap in perception between employees and employers, supervisors who think they're fostering inclusion, if we narrow that gap just by 50%, we could increase the US GDP by more than $1 trillion by the economic impact of employees who feel like they're included and therefore show up at work more, show up engaged, contribute more, and add to that productivity in ways that drive profits. This, my friends, is the case for economic inclusion. This is the work that we do inside my organization every day as we work with business leaders. So what are the characteristics of an economy that is inclusive? We think it comes down to these 3 basic tenets that we borrowed in partnership from the Rockefeller Foundation, who studied and identified about 160 indicators of an inclusive regional economy. We boiled them down to these 3 areas for us to focus on. Do we have in our marketplace access to opportunity such that everyone in our community can access and participate in the economy through markets, being workers, consumers, and business owners? And can we participate in equitable ways? Upward mobility. Can all people move up the economy in ways that are in their own dreams and their own ideations, ways that allow them to accumulate wealth? A significant differentiation from simply having a job, but actually being able to accumulate wealth and pass that wealth down throughout generations. And can you move throughout the economy and make investments with confidence in your own future? And do we have increased empowerment? Are individuals of all racial backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds able to drive economic growth in their communities, in their neighborhoods, within their own spheres of influence, using innovation, creativity, and business growth, again, on their own terms, recognizing that any particular neighborhood or commercial district may not need to look like the next one. Things in White Bear Lake may not need to look like they do in St. Paul, and yet the economic growth engines must be in place. The policies and structures and procedures must be flowing in ways that are equitable and inclusive and allow that economic growth to continue to churn for all racial and ethnic groups at the same time that the region's economy continues to grow and churn. Those are three characteristics that we look for when we measure whether or not we have an inclusive economy happening for us here in this region and other regions that we work in. To drive that, in our organization, we foster solutions to employers and policymakers that are three things. We look for solutions that first center Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian people. You might ask yourself, well, why center those populations? Historically, and you're going to ask me later about policies, historically, our policies have been designed to center the needs of white people. First white men, then white women, and then later we've tinkered around the edges to adapt them and see if they could work a little bit better for other people. But I like to describe that process as being similar to a recipe. If you've ever cooked something and it simply came out horrible, your family said this is absolutely horrible, and you thought to yourself, well, wait a minute, it's a bad night, it's already late. Do I want to just tinker with it a little bit? Maybe we could add something to it. When you start tinkering with something that's horrible, it rarely comes out good. With our policies, we've often done just that. We've said, wait a minute, I know it doesn't work for you. I know it is making life horrible for you, but what if we just tinker around the edges? What if we just change one or two things and then see if that still works for you? Okay, that didn't work. Let's just tinker around the edges with something else. And we've spent generations trying to tinker around the edges with systems that weren't just not built for people of color, but were specifically built to exclude, to economically exclude Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian people that were systematically built to say you are not equal, you are not good enough to participate in this system. And instead we've said, but we're just going to tinker with it. We come to this and say that hasn't worked yet, and our continual hope that it will doesn't add up to the intelligence that we have as people. So we should use that intelligence to say, what systems can we design that are truly going to work for all people? And if we design them for the very people who've been excluded for our economy, we will know that they work for all people. We then say, let's make sure those solutions are data informed, not simply data driven, because too often our data has also not used the very experts who are experiencing those systems. So we put those experts at the center. So you are expert at your own life, and therefore you should be the experts of the data as well, but are data informed and are market responsive. And there's where we bring in business to say, how do we have businesses who are not only engaged in the charitable sense, but are also engaged using the business knowledge that so often is disconnected from solutions we think of as social. We bring those three characteristics to the work that you see on the right of the screen: economic development, human capital, transportation, and housing, and work to create solutions that don't live in silos, but become very integrated in everything that we do. We drive those solutions over into three distinct areas: fostering shared accountability, which means that we must all work arm in arm in ways that we've never worked before, across sectors, public, government agencies, private sector businesses and agencies, nonprofits, philanthropy, and community itself, all very integrated, thinking differently about how we leverage our personal agency, not only 8 to 5, but around the clock, to drive anti-racist practices and procedures. Things like this very convening right now, getting together in the evenings to talk about the very actions we can take within our spheres of influence to dismantle institutional racism and cast a new light on the ways we work together, to ensure that we move the needle not only on metrics, but also on the ways of belonging and inclusion and equity. We work with employers, offering consulting services to help change our government agencies, to help them measure what they're doing, but to make sure those measurements actually produce the changes we want to see long-term in people's lives, making sure that we know, is what we're doing actually making a difference in someone's life at the end of the day? And how do we know that on a particular population? And we work to cultivate place-based regional opportunity, which speaks to thinking about neighborhoods that historically we might have kind of given that black eye to say, wait a minute, that's one we should avoid or that we're not investing in. We think about that through the lens of devaluation, understanding the historic trauma that has taken place as we've pulled wealth out of neighborhoods, as we've undervalued people, place, and things, and start to restore that wealth through intentional public policy and private sector and business policy, through banking policy, and elevate people at the center of each one of these solutions. Through this, we have a distinct lens on the measurements that we're seeking, and that is to be sure that we end up getting to wealth equity. Yes, employment. Yes, increasing income. But at the end of the day, wealth is important. Wealth has been extracted from too many of our communities of color, and we want to be sure that it is returned into those communities so that, again, we're getting to that point of equitable opportunity at the same time our region's economy grows. We use these tools in our work day to day. We leverage FSG's 6 systems of systems change to help leaders and decision makers think about the policies, practices, how resource flows and dollars can move throughout an organization, throughout a community to drive change. The relationships that you and I have, whether or not they're not just more diverse, but whether or not those relationships are changing in ways that actually lead to more equitable growth. It's one thing for you and I to know one another. It's another thing for you and I to have enough trust with one another for you to extend your network on my behalf in ways that lead to equitable change, in ways that lead to wealth transfer or income transfer. We use this to think about power dynamics. Something that we rarely feel comfortable talking about is something that we elevate constantly. Power is at the root often of wealth not moving, of economic development not changing in ways that are racially equitable. We also work to help leaders think about the mental models that hold us back. That if we have things happening, such as wage inequities, that means that we must start to get to the root cause analysis of where we learned things like it's okay to pay someone of a different race less than their white peer for the same amount of work. The roots of that are in slavery, where we were taught that people who look like me were not worth the same thing as their white peers. Doing that root cause analysis inside of a business or inside of a government agency helps us to undo the racism that is taking place today that often goes by many other names. We filter those 6 conditions of systems change over into creating new policies and practices in talent attraction, retention, and advancement, in procurement and supply chains, in the public policies and practices of our corporate agencies and partners, in their philanthropy, and even in their products, sales, and services, making sure that they're reaching the very diverse markets that can help grow and sustain their businesses. We drive that same framework into our work with local and regional and government agencies, ensuring that they're doing their very best job and the most racially equitable job of serving the very communities who fund the tax base and deserve to be sure that that work is taking place in a way that is racially equitable and inclusive. And our approach to that is helping us ensure that we're delivering solutions and results. A brief summary of some of the results that we've been able to drive before I pause for some questions are grouped in these few answers or few summary points in terms of the impact that we've driven over our first 3 years. We center our work often in the space of how we change the narrative about racial equity and inclusive economic growth. Over 8,000 leaders participated in our educational services. You mentioned earlier our program we had just today. We do a lot of sessions for leaders to come together and learn. We do an annual summit, convenings for leaders to learn not only about racial equity and inclusion, but also about the steps and actions that we can take every day in our organizations to create more racial equity and shared accountability. We've been able to change the narrative about racial equity and inclusive growth over the last 3 years and have an ambitious agenda to continue that. We developed the first indicators for an inclusive regional economy in the country that's being used by local governments and agencies as well as businesses, 14 indicators available on our website to be able to measure how we're doing, and more importantly, to then integrate that into each one of our organizations to take measurable change and institutionalize those policies. MSP employers turn to the center for change and to ensure that they're reaching talent that has historically been excluded. We created a program several years ago to connect African-American men in North Minneapolis to employers who needed talent, but had not previously turned to this particular population for talent. We worked with community-based organizations who also had not historically received funding from the state of Minnesota or local government partners and foundations for turnaround services, and have been able to equip and place more than 200 African-American men into family-sustaining jobs paying more than $18 an hour through the North at Work partnership, and now seed the leadership of that program directly into the hands of African-American-led organizations. We've partnered with more than 9 local and regional and state organizations, government agencies, in order to give them the tools that are needed to center Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx populations and racial equity in their competitiveness and inclusion plans. And next month, Ramsey County will approve a plan that we've worked with them on for the last year in order to center racial equity and economic competitiveness in the future of Ramsey County's growth, a plan that will be the first in the state of Minnesota. And we partnered with Met Council and the Greater MSP to develop the first regional economic framework for the region that ensures that cities, counties, and other agencies can secure federal dollars and resources in order to, again, center racial equity in our region's growth and prosperity. And lastly, after George Floyd's murder at the hands of Minneapolis police, over 30 national and global corporations, foundations, and organizations turned to the center for guidance, support, and investment to ensure that they did not just have a knee-jerk response after we issued our call to action to CEOs to make sure that their response was guided and was racially responsive and effective following that murder. We're proud of the dollars that have flowed, but more than that, we're proud of the effort that has been put in. And US Bank's announcement just yesterday is one example of the types of partnerships and consulting that we offer and continue to guide in terms of the business community around not only Minneapolis-St. Paul, but also the country. I'll pause there for our first break for questions.
Tawana, thank you so very much. You offered up so much information. I'm glad that we're recording this so I can have an opportunity to go back and review much of the data that you've displayed in your various slides. And to that point, actually, I know from my personal experience that data is something we use as a measure in an effort to quantify stuff we want to know. And sometimes the measure is an accurate reflection of the information we seek. But it seems that some of the data that you're displaying is based upon people's choices and behaviors. So I would like to know, how do perceptions of bias and behavior affect people's attitudes and actions? For example, why haven't we made more progress in achieving racial justice in the last 50 years?
Absolutely, that's a fantastic question. I think getting to the roots of that require a lot of peeling of the onion. And I love the way that you framed that question. I think part of it is, one, our consciousness about the role that race and racism play in those outcomes. I get a question often that says, are we surprised by the data? I moved to Minnesota 11 years ago. And as a transplant wife, I've been a trailing spouse my entire marriage, following my husband around with Cargill, and you always get the move packet. If you've been a relocation wife or a relocation person, you get the packet that tells you about your community. When I got that packet 11 years ago, Diversity Inc. had done a study saying Minnesota can't keep professionals of color. They're struggling with this. What are we going to do? I think we've probably had 4 of those studies since then. The Economic Policy Institute has studied that's right over and over and over. The shock, though, 11 years ago is different than the shock today. And I think our attribution to whether or not it's about racism or it's about the people is starting to evolve. So I would answer that by saying our ability to reconcile that where the choice lies will move us to a different action. For a long time, we have prescribed the solution to be fixing Black and brown people. If we fix them, then the numbers will change. And that's been it. And now we're saying, okay, wait a minute, we've done a lot of fixing. We've invested a lot of money and that hasn't done anything. And wait a minute, now we've had a man killed at the hands of police, but can really the police be the only people who have anything wrong with them? That doesn't really seem right either, right? So people are, I think, reconciling with, wait a minute, it has to be deeper than that, and moving to this place to say, I don't have to be a racist to have racism in me, right? To have some work to do. And so how do we move to this place of anti-racism that says, how do I just wake up every day and say, what am I going to do to be hyper vigilant against racism and not get hung up on whether or not I'm a racist? Because that language, I think, can keep us from taking actions that move the needle.
Thank you. Here's another question born of the same impetus, and that is that complex issues such as this one implicate very complex solutions. And trying to tackle all of a complex problem can be overwhelming. So focusing on one part of the issue, the problem, the solution, makes it more accessible in terms of what might be done. I know you've worked with many corporate entities in your effort to address or to create a more inclusive and diverse economy. But part of the solution, and I glean this in part from listening to your programs, involves entrepreneurship among Black and Brown business people. Can you say something about how important this kind of entrepreneurship is to closing the income gap and overcoming racial inequities that you've pointed out?
Absolutely. I truly appreciate that. So one, I want to acknowledge what you said about the need to have sometimes breaking it down into different silos and pieces. And we always welcome and encourage our partners, our clients, to walk through the door that you're ready to walk through. So while we work on 5 areas, we meet people where they are, because that's critical in this work. To the second question about entrepreneurship, if we were to see Black-owned businesses alone increase their investments, right? Increase their size by just 15% across this country, we could close the vast majority of both the employment and the income gap in this country. So as it relates to racism, right? As it relates to the wage gap in corporate America could shift its focus from the struggles that many corporations have had with hiring and simply say, okay, cool. We're willing to invest in Black-owned businesses. We're willing to spend our dollars with in procurement and scale and grow those businesses. We're willing to do shelf space if we're Target, if we're a retail business, and Target is doing this right now and is participating in the 1585 strategy right now nationally. But taking that stance to say, let's make sure those businesses grow and scale, and not only thinking about where our minds often go to the retail establishments, restaurants, which are important in the service economy, but those growth industry businesses, those firms that are in IT and fintech and other firms that are really going to grow and scale and create family sustaining earning jobs. That's a place where all of us in our business spaces and our government agencies can truly lean in. When we look at the studies that have been done in Minnesota, there's a disparity study that's been done with most of the public sector agencies. Some participated, most participated, not all. But the amount of spending that is going to our businesses, this is not charity. This is dollars being spent. The dollars are going to be spent anyway, is slim to none going into our Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian-owned businesses. So when we look at why aren't they growing, well, you've got to spend the dollars. And so it's an affirmative choice. It's making that choice to say we want to see them thrive. We know that they're more likely to hire people who look like them, just as white business owners are more likely to hire people who look like them. It's science. So we could spend those dollars and see our economy grow and see that wage gap and employment gap change in our communities very quickly, simply by making that targeted choice.
Thank you, Tawana. If we might, can we move on to part 2 or question 2, asking you about the center's goals in the context of the next steps you anticipate?
Absolutely. We are so excited about this next phase of our work as we go into deeper into 2021. The year has already begun, and we've begun convening our partners and business leaders into what we're framing as the Anti-Racism and Economic Justice Trust. Part of the wording for this is about how we do build trust together across sectors, across communities in order to close gaps. And the framing I used earlier is that we can't heal until we address racism. And we have to address racism by becoming anti-racist. And so we've begun partnering and convening our business leaders in government agencies and establish these goals. And so for 2025, we are partnering across this region to address that wage gap that I've spoken about earlier, to increase the number of Black and Indigenous workers in family sustaining paying jobs by 10%, and another 10% as it relates to our Latinx workers. And the numbers are a little bit different, but both by 10%. And I'm stressing the family sustaining piece here, which is a little bit different if you're accustomed to hearing living wage. The family sustaining number is higher because we all know what it takes to be able to actually sustain a family here in this community and any community across the country. And the numbers piece is important. And we have an opportunity here from a public policy standpoint. We're using our lobbying arm at the center and also partnering with our communities to ensure that we're actually drawing down dollars, both federally, using the flexibility that comes with dollars like the CARES Act and others, to ensure that all of our effort is going toward getting as many families as we can into those family sustaining jobs, and being very targeted about that. We're also, as we think about our 10-year efforts, then looking to ensure that as we do this, we're connecting it directly to growth in regional GDP. For a long time, we've looked at those goals around racial equity and regional economic growth as two opposites, that when the economy constricts, we focus less on racial equity. When the economy's good, then we come back and focus on it more like it's charity. The data shows it does not have to be that way. We can make these two goals very much linked. And that is what we're driving for the next 10 years. Increasing the number of family sustained jobs at those BIPOC owned businesses, increasing the jobs in each city throughout the 7-county metro, increasing the spend that is occurring by those members of our trust, so the employers and public sector agencies that were partnering with us, making sure that we support them in their efforts to do the internal work that is required to increase that spending with those businesses. And then that those businesses are represented in partnership. It takes us working together in order to fulfill these goals. And that ultimately we should see those gaps that we've talked about before begin to decrease. And we measure that year over year using the indicators that are on our website and reporting those in very transparent ways so that the community has an opportunity to engage in this. This is the framework that we elevate in terms of what we ask our partners to do, to be in relationship with community so that we're co-creating, that we no longer have business creating their solutions over here and community over there and not really ever together. And it feels like you're together, but you're really, the power isn't there. We really drive a model that's about shared power and transferring power. With BIPOC communities, if you're not familiar with that term, it's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We try to say it all out as much as we can. So Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and people of color communities to achieve income and wealth equity, that we have to be sharing power and transferring power into those communities. Establishing goals and investing responsibly. We did not get here overnight. We won't get here with light touch investments and light touch policy changes. The action must be just as strong as the actions and policies that got us to this point. And adaptive learning that allows us to really undo the learning that we have been taught for so long. And our commitment, as you see here on the bottom, is to really drive the foundation that allows this work to take place. We don't do the work all at the center. Our work is to support those businesses and policymakers and government leaders who are committed to doing it in partnership and relationship and solidarity with the communities who are on the front lines of this work. And ultimately, we believe truly that we have a big choice in our region and across the country where we work, that it is possible for us to build an economy that works together and works for everyone. And we're ultimately committed to doing that. And I can pause there for us to have a dialogue.
Thank you, Tawana. Here is one of the questions we've got. How, given where you hope or what you hope to realize, how important are local community resilience, support, and networking, and how reasonable is it to rely on those measures in overcoming the structural barriers that you've talked about? I've heard Black and brown entrepreneurs, local business people here in the Twin Cities talk about how important reaching out to community was in the wake of the riots after George Floyd's death, for example. How realistic is it to look at resilience, networking, and so forth?
I think it's significantly realistic and also important. I think you mentioned our Reckoning to Rise series that we've had this month, and I think to today's conversation with our panelists who two are Black business owners in our community. All are working with Black business owners in our communities, both locally and nationally. And when I think about the resilience that already exists in community, it's so powerful. And one of our questions and discussions today was about, do we already have the tools or do we need new tools? And a lot of it was just about the tools may be there, but are the tools cycling through the right hands? And are we acknowledging those tools when they are in the right hands? Is the power moving? Are there new forms of power occurring? And are we acknowledging that? And so I think it can't be understated or overstated what is occurring and the relationship power. And if you have a resource or a tool, being able to bring that to bear, even though we're in our own homes, we're in some form of quarantine, the relationship power is significant and can't be over exhibited in this hour.
Here's another question related to how the community at large can help you to realize the work you've described. And that is, what can local units of government, educational institutions, K-12 as well as post-secondary, and the Minnesota legislature undertake to help foster economic inclusion?
Absolutely. Great question. Big question. So a few things. There are lots of things, but certainly local governments and state governments can invest with a lens for anti-racism and equity, have a clear line of sight and don't let up off of it. We have more data at our disposal than is ever deployed. It's just that simple. The data is there, and right now it is not informing decisions. Local and state and regional governments should be deploying hands into Black and Indigenous and Latinx and Asian hands, and those organizations that are led by those communities. And too often we're not, even where we've seen under Governor Dayton's administration, equity appropriations that were done in small form. It started off as 100 million, it went down to 35, right now it's down to about 18, and none of it's coming from the general fund. There are significant investments that could be happening to close racial wealth gaps that are not occurring. And so as a League of Women Voters who are motivated about this topic, informing your legislators to take different actions, following the money, following the corporations who follow the money and invest in the money is important. Local governments, similarly, we have the city of St. Paul who is studying reparations right now. Wherever you fall on that issue, the issues behind the issue are important. And so understanding those issues, understanding how they relate to community, and again, encouraging policymakers to center the people who are experiencing racial inequities as experts. They are experts. They don't have to have the title we have to be the experts. They are experts because they are living their own story. So that is what policymakers can say. I would say lastly, for universities and colleges, Metro State has been doing some wonderful work by thinking very critically about their own land and land that is available to them in order to move economic inclusion in their neighborhood, listening to their students, listening to the business owners around them to say, what should we do with land that is around us? Is it needed for housing? Is it needed for business development and growth? And how are we the best possible steward of community growth through a lens of equity and inclusion? Other universities can do that. They can also think about it in terms of students who are coming on board who may not be able to grow in jobs, but may need to be entrepreneurs. And how can universities elevate that talent and partner with us using the indicators to tell the true narrative about what's occurring in our economy?
Here's one last question for part 2, and then we'll go to part 3 and see if we can figure out some ways we might be useful. This question has to do with disruptive leadership, or the good trouble that we've heard conversations about. What kinds of disruptive leadership might help close racial equity gaps in Minnesota's urban communities and in Minnesota's rural communities?
That is a great question. The word disruptor means something so unique to each one of us. I think it's a great word. I got an award for that title years ago, and one of my board members said, "Ooh, should you accept that award?" And so there's some people who that word name seems troublesome to, and other people who love that award. So what I would say is determine what it means for you. You may need to be a disruptor in your living room. There may be people who come around your living room table who need to have their thought processes disrupted. You might have a circle, though, that is wider and is in your business or is in your community. It may be in your place of worship. It may be in your children's school where you need to disrupt the thinking, the ideas, the policies that get made, and may need to remind people to see people with a little different humanity. What I would say, though, is each one of us, myself included, we all need to have our thinking disrupted almost daily about race and racism if we truly want to have the community that we espouse, that we want to have. And the consciousness of waking up every day and saying, if I want to go to sleep tonight with this world, truly not just being a better place in a Pollyanna-ish way, but truly want to get to a place where it is racially equitable, where we do not see the sins and atrocities of race that we are seeing today, then we all have to take the responsibility of saying, I'm not going to be silent when I see that. I'm going to read more. I'm going to ask more questions. I'm going to dig into that. I'm going to stop my car and observe that situation when I see it happening. I'm going to ask about that salary level. I'm going to ask about that interview process. Ask. I'm going to hold myself accountable. I'm going to interrogate my own values and if they're showing up in my own actions over and over and over, until we start to see the results. And if we don't see the results, then we have to dig into the groundwater to say, why is it happening that way?
Thank you so much, Tawana. Now to our third question, which is very important to us because we're an education and advocacy organization and appreciate the importance of becoming educated about issues, the importance of conversations with stakeholders, people whom together we can hope to make the kinds of changes we think are important. And so the question, how can education and advocacy organizations like the League of Women Voters, like our other sponsors, help support the center's work? And if I can just make a brief comment, White Bear Lake is less diverse than the East Metro area. I think it's about 10% minority population versus 30% minority population in the East Metro area generally. However, there are many local entities and individuals that do want to address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in a meaningful way. Are there actions? What actions are there around education, employment, income, poverty, home ownership, or other areas where the local community might help support the important work of your center?
Absolutely. Well, first, I want to say just a big thank you for even inviting me here tonight to be able to talk about this work, to be able to talk about this topic. It's an honor and a pleasure, and I love it when I get invited out to the surrounding communities who may not know as much about this work, but who are absolutely invested in closing racial employment and income and wealth gaps and in fostering inclusion and belonging. It means a lot to me. So thank you for the welcome and the invitation. Give me one moment. Excuse me. So ways to be actively engaged. I want to first acknowledge, I see Commissioner Reinhardt here, who's been a great partner for us at Ramsey County, and I've been honored to be able to work alongside her and her colleagues over the last year. And one of the things I'm most encouraged by are just how many communities are doing deep work that often is just unknown. And so one of the first things I would say is take full advantage of the opportunities to not only follow us in social media and our website and our partners and colleagues who you'll be able to pick up on there as well, such that when we're hosting things not only that are our core work, but also the work of our partners, particularly in the local and regional governments, participate in those. Encourage people you know who may not be the folks you would say. Often when folks see me, they say, oh, but I'm not a CEO. That's just what you see. I'd say, like, that's just what I do on TV. Like, that's not the real work. That's not the true work. The real work happens late at night with folks like you. Like, this is the work. This is the true work, right? The real work is when I'm reading through the comments from people who have sent us stuff that's the real things they're going through. That's the real work. That's the work that counts. Not that the CEOs don't count. They count too, but that's not the heart of the work. And so encourage people who might see the stuff on TV and say, oh, that's not for me, to remember that it is for them, that we need to hear the actual experiences. That my team, the headline on all of our materials is that we can never get too far away from the actual experience of the folks that we started in this work for. And that are folks who have been excluded from our economy. So make sure that anytime you see us posting a forum, or because we're in this world, we're often doing online forums and chats and surveys. Our street teams still get out to do street outreach when we are hired for that, but we are having to be more remote in this COVID environment. So please help us reach folks who wouldn't otherwise be reached, so that we make sure we constantly have that voice. So that's one. The other thing is, I also see a former ALF board member peer, Jean Nichols, on this call too. It's great to see you, Jean. And so I would say encourage also outreach with and in partnership with organizations like the African American Leadership Forum, the Coalition of Asian American Leaders, the Latino Lead Group, who are Somali Lead, who are all in partnership with Linking Leaders, which is one of our partners. So the ethnic and racial organizations who have leaders in racial and ethnic communities who are constantly not only out, and you see maybe the conferences that may be designed specifically for their organizations, but who also are working in earnest to change public policies, who are working in earnest to address those core issues that you referenced earlier in health, in education, in economics, who are working in earnest in partnership with us on public policy. So while we may be on the front lines on the corporate side and the public policy side, we rely deeply on their work and being able to bring the grassroots voices up to us and make sure that we have that, as well as being able to do that leadership pipeline development, make sure that leaders are brought to the table. So being able to support their work, whether you're supporting it charitably or you're elevating the voices that come from those groups and giving, I want to call this giving credibility, and yet it shouldn't have to be that way, and yet it just still is that way in many cases. So elevate and endorse those voices, and the importance of those voices speaking as themselves. And if I could highlight one, the Coalition of Asian American Leaders very recently just released a report that's available on their site, CAALMN.org, about the very different experiences that are happening in different ethnic groups within the Asian community, and the need for us to understand what's happening within those different groups, and then invest differently and have public policies that are different based on the very complexities that exist within Minnesota's Asian American groups. And so that research is important for anyone who's interested in being able to further economic growth. Right now, the hate crimes that are being perpetrated against Asians throughout our country is sinful and is not being talked about nearly as much as it should be across our country. And so being able to not only think about the positives that happen in our communities, but being able to speak up and speak out when negatives happen, and being able to walk in solidarity with those communities is critical. And the racial and ethnic groups, I would say, have been doing a lot of work together behind the scenes, but having organizations like yours walk in solidarity with us is very critical and a great way of partnering as well. And certainly those issue areas is housing affordability is a crisis area for all people, particularly in the low and moderate income areas of our communities. Education is impacted all of us. And if COVID has taught any of us anything, is that maybe the one area where we truly are all in the same boat right now and need to advocate and partner together to ensure that all children are able to thrive. Those issues are core, and there are many organizations working on them. So to the extent that we can speak not only with solidarity, but also when we get seats at the table. I am a Shirley Chisholm lover and believe in bringing my own chair to the table into the room, but that we leave with more chairs at the table for other people. There are lots of rooms that I can get invited to. It's important for me to make sure when I walk out of that room, there are more chairs for more people, both who look like me and people who don't.
Tawana, this has been absolutely wonderful. I do know that you began this not feeling particularly well, And you were so kind to persevere despite all of it. This has been a wonderful learning opportunity for all of us. I hope we can take this forward and actualize some of your recommendations. At this point, our league president, Liz Lauder, has a few closing remarks that she would like to make.
Well, thanks, Lisa, and thank you, Tawana. This has been really amazing. I think this is giving us a new way of thinking about things, of ways of challenging our preconceived ideas and challenging the data that we've been given that doesn't include all of the community that we want to help and represent. It's given us ideas of how we can partner with different groups and get the word out and think differently about situations and think differently and act differently. So I want to thank Tawana and I want to thank Lisa for facilitating the discussion tonight. Again, I want to thank our partners tonight who are supporting us. This is the Shoreview Human Rights Commission and the Do Good Roseville. I'm going to put their information in the chat in case you would like to know more about those groups. We have really appreciated everyone's participation tonight, and we thank you for coming. We are doing some more work in the future for educating our communities on different public policy issues. So stay tuned and we'll provide some more. So thank you again for coming and have a good night, everyone.
Keep well.